My name is Danika Littlechild. The concept of resilience is one that recognizes the fact that individuals and communities are resilient when they do well in spite of severe hardships, trauma, and deprivation. There are many models of resilience out there. A lot of them have to do with health and environment. However, not a lot of these models are able to address diverse cultures, histories, and social and geographic settings. So resilience is not just, for me, about returning to an original state after suffering from a stress or a hardship. It's also about being able to self-regulate. It's about self-care. It's about growth. And most importantly for me, transformation. Adapting to new challenges and demands. When we think about resilience, we usually consider it as something demonstrated in the past, a kind of a retrospective phenomenon. However, the other aspect of resilience is anticipatory, the ability to adjust to something that may not have happened yet. People are generally pretty good at retrospective exercises. We are less gifted when it comes to being anticipatory because it requires us to be critical thinkers of the world around us as well as ourselves. And being anticipatory requires us to recognize that that exercise in and of itself might be cultural. So what I think of as good planning for the future may not be what you consider good planning for the future, and those diverse notions may be culturally informed. So there's cultural diversity in conceptualizing resilience, and that matters for how we relate to one another and what kinds of relationships we build for the future. We are even less gifted, unfortunately, when it comes to the moment of taking insight to action. So this is why the recent development at the United Nations is so surprising and fairly singular. A few days ago, in September of 2015, the United Nations adopted the Sustainable Development Goals. A lot of folks don't know what the Sustainable Development Goals are, or global goals as they're being called by the United Nations. What they are a set of 17 goals that were drafted in a collaborative process between states and major stakeholders, civil society groups from all over the world. Many thousands of people contributed to the development of these goals. So what are the Sustainable Development Goals? They were born out of the UN, out of a process called Rio and Rio Plus 20. Many people may not also know about that process. But essentially, what you need to know is that the UN has been thinking about our relationship to each other and to the environment for quite a while now. When we think about the Sustainable Development Goals, what I am personally hoping is that we can recognize that the collaborative nature of the process that led up to their development, as well as the possibility for their implementation, is where, for me, resilience comes into play. Now, out of all the goals that were developed by states, civil society groups, indigenous peoples, and other stakeholders, one goal was developed regarding cities in particular and human settlements, and that's Goal 11, which sets out to make cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. These goals, having been the product of a series of negotiations over the last 2 to 3 years, are very significant in the way that they are worded, in the cadence of their rhythm. There is meaning behind everything. Everything was negotiated. The way the sentences begin to describe the goals. And so talking about resilience when it comes to cities and human settlements into the future in that anticipatory way. Thinking about what is the world that we want to live in as human beings on the earth, but also in all of our diversity. Resilient cities and resilient human settlements rated as one of a small number of goals. So when the SDGs were developed, they didn't just set out simple goals. They decided to try to describe those goals. And so in that goal 11, there are 7 paragraphs that follow to describe the content of this goal and what the role is for people in cities, influencers, people who are leaders, people who are just regular community members, and what needs to happen for resilient cities to become a reality. They talk about adequate, safe, and affordable housing. They talk about sustainable transport systems. They talk about safeguarding the world's cultural and natural heritage, and they do see a role for culture. When you think about the type of effort that went into negotiating consensus on the content of what we think of as resiliency into the future, it's really quite remarkable that they finished this document at all. But it's also remarkable because we may all have an opportunity to play a role in it. And in fact, sometimes I hear people say quite jaded things about the United Nations. And I think that's to be expected. But I think what we need to shift away from is an expectation of somebody telling us what needs to be done, and shift into a new form of anticipatory resiliency, which means building our own capacity to engage. And that's why the role of Indigenous peoples, of municipalities, of civil society organizations becomes so important when we think about building resiliency into the future. It is much easier to understand resiliency in a retrospective lens. And certainly you could look at the example of Indigenous peoples in Canada. The resilience of Indigenous peoples, nations, and communities stood up to forces like colonization, organized efforts to displace, exclude, or even destroy Indigenous communities. There was a residential school era. There were other methods developed to suppress and extinguish cultures through forced assimilation. There's ongoing racism and discrimination, that's a reality. And there's also the possibilities of the flip side of that coin. All of the effort that's been put into the past into things like that could be flipped, and the energy applied to creating collaborative and truly resilient, cohesive communities where everybody has a role to play and a voice to say what they'd like to see their place and space look and feel like. Thank you. Hi, hi.